Good evening, everybody. So today we are on the fourth day of the 6-day webinar series organized by Modernity of Maharaja's College and IQAC of Maharaja's College. And today we have Professor Dr. A.K. Ramakrishnan. He holds a Bachelor's in Science from University of Calicut, Master's in Middle Eastern Studies from University of Mysore, MPhil from Jawaharlal University, and PhD on American Perspectives of Iran, a study in Orientalism at Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala. He also held various academic positions at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, Bucknell University, Pennsylvania, and Cairo University, Cairo. He has authored various books related to Middle East and numerous articles on Keralite politics and culture. Without much ado, I request Professor Dr. A.K. Ramakrishnan to hand over the session. He will be dealing on new society movements. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anak. Um, my job this afternoon is to say something about new social movements. The title has civil society also. I won't go a whole lot into the aspect of civil society, but try to link social movements with civil society as well. Actually, this December is significant in many ways. We are witnessing an ongoing farmers' struggle, and that's a major movement that we can see on the streets of northern India. We have witnessed during last December the anti-CAA protests in Delhi and particularly in the Jamia Nagar area and in many other parts of India. So it's the anniversary of that this December. This December is also the 10th anniversary of the beginning of the Arab uprisings, starting with Tunisia in December 2010. Many movements have happened over the last several decades, and many movements are ongoing in different parts of the world. The idea of new social movements emerged when academics and people involved with movements were trying to grapple with the transformation in the nature of movements across the globe. Particularly finding out whether there are any major differences between conventional movements, say during the late 19th century, early 20th century, different parts of the world, including Kerala, witnessed several movements. They were conventionally put as social reform movements. And in many parts of what was then called the Third World was witnessing national liberation movements of various kinds, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, but in Africa mostly, in the 60s, the Algerian National Liberation Movement, and many other movements. So we have seen the major movements of the 19th and 20th century that marked significant changes, sometimes major changes, and national liberation movements bringing in new notions about politics, anti-imperialism, um, particular kinds of nationalism as a resistance rather than um, as a system in enforcing a system supporting ideology as you see it now. Um, so several movements have happened in the past. What was the differentiating feature of the movements that emerged, say, from the 1970s onwards, from the early 20th century or late 19th century movements? So once you have these differences projected and these movements from the 1970s onwards being called as new social movements, then you were differentiating that with old movements including the reform movements and the nationalist movement and anti-imperialist movements and the working class movements which were there from the mid-19th century onwards in a big manner. The Chicago working class movement, women workers movements, and so on and so forth. So some way of differentiating the traditional movements and the new social movements were some kind of an engagement in the academic circles in particular and in certain activist circles as well. Um, the differentiation that was made was concerning the effects of modernity in general. If modernity was about progress, about development, if modernity was about bringing in newer technologies and transforming societies through the developments induced by newer kind of capital and technology, if modernity brought in the um, better sides of science, of rationality, and if modernity was about establishing citizenship in a variety of ways, imagining sovereignty, uh, and somewhere thinking about the linkage between what is called as civil society and state, where individuals and communities were becoming important. Mostly in the heydays of modernity, individual rights, questions of citizenship, etc., were very, very important. So what the anti-imperialist movements in the global south was stressing on was the requirement of a sovereign nation state for many of the countries which were under colonialism of the French or the British or the Italians or the Spanish and so on and so forth. So bringing in sovereignty to the people was a major aspect of that thinking about modernity. And movements in general, particularly in the second half of 19th century onwards, were trying to think about modern technologies, markets, capital, and other things, And the working class movements in general were trying to critique the way of that working and thinking about the modern working class as something that promotes human progress, at the same time stands for justice um, and equality at certain levels. Um, the assertion of modernity was very significant. Um, Even in the non-Western world, even though many scholars would talk about modernity uh, having a different course altogether in the global South, uh, but there was a kind of engagement with Western modernity uh, during this period. And what that brought in was um, newer notions of the individual person, the notion about citizenship, and so on and so forth. A rational human being, and so on. So the what is referred to now as old social movements or the reform movements in various parts of the world, they were trying to project elements of modernity in their movements. So if you think about the, those social movements in Kerala, for example, the attempt was, whether it was Narayana Gurus, Ayyankalis, or various other Vakamaulavis and various other kinds of positions, both in thought and in movements, they were trying to imagine a new human being, somebody endowed with rights, dignity, and some notions about progress. So modernity was setting in, and social movements were uh, in the late 19th and first half of 20th century was important in bringing in those elements of the new human entity, which is not the conventional human entity, which is um, immersed in feudal, colonial, and other kinds of subjugation. There is a sense of a liberated, rational, um, dignified human citizenship being imagined. And movements were waged in order to assert those positions. The working class movement, anti-imperialist resistance movement, the nationalist movements of those times were trying to project what Ngugi was referring to as the resistance tradition in the history of movements. Um, so that resistance was both against colonialism, imperialism, but also against all forms of hierarchies that existed in these particular societies. So even those social movements of that time, the reform movements, etc., tried to address the social in much more involved manner, while the nationalist and resistance movements of various kinds trying to address the nation state that was emerging. But there was some kind of um, association between these two, even though they were understood separately as two separate phenomena. But they were agreeing with the principles of modernity, modern citizenship, sovereignty, uh, dignified individuals with rights, uh, and rationality and science and things of that sort. So if these elements have already come into the fore through those movements, Then what is new about the new social movements of the last, say, 50 years or so? Um, Many analysts uh, try to make it as some kind of critique of modernity, the new social movements as a critique of modernity, while the old social movements were basically bringing in modernity. Because the effects of modernity is hegemonic kinds of notions, um, certain arenas of science and technology itself being utilized for domination, and many development projects of new nation states becoming a kind of authoritarian process where people were losing lands, their living conditions, and so on and so forth. So the new social movements were depicted by many people as something that went against the traditional movement's stress on modernity. So the new social movements, even though may have elements of modernity in it, but try to offer a criticism as well. And then the differentiation between the old and the new was again made by pointing towards the political and the social nature of movements. Um, Even though it's a complicated matter, whether the old social movements were simply social, not political, but as I've said, there were elements of sovereignty, elements of um, citizenship, and so on and so forth. So they were both social and political in conventional terms as well. And the new social movements also had a mix of both social and political within that. So some were social, some political, that doesn't function. But what was made into new social movements is a new way of addressing society and politics. Um, and those ways come up through a critique of the nation state itself and its functioning. It comes from a development, a criticism of contemporary notions of development, and a way of, addressing hegemony in a variety of ways. Um, the new social movement thinking also was trying to talk about civil society, and then somewhere trying to delink it from the state. So the civil society and state, that distinction was brought in by some social movement analysts, especially the new social movement analysts. My point here is that the differentiation that were made, say from the 80s onwards, by people writing on new social movements, and much of the literature came out in the late 80s and mostly in the 1990s, they were trying to make distinctions, which, if you look back now, seem to be too much of a differentiation, because we will find that there are elements of overlapping in the concerns and the agenda that old social movements and new social movements have brought. So that's one point that I want to assert. A clear-cut distinction between the old and the new is not completely possible, even though you can identify, as I've already mentioned, a critique of elements of modernity that have become hegemonic, a critique of development in the way that occurred, which again produces newer forms of uh, hegemonic forces, authoritarianism, new technocratic world, and so on and so forth. Um, and the new social moment also brought in a large chunk of criticism of the way uh, our environment should be understood. An ecological perspective was developing in a strong sense, and questions of talking about work and the possibility of work itself and distinguishing that with traditional working class movements, etc., were also happening in the new social movement uh, period or, or contemporary times in general. So when we talk about movements, from what I've mentioned until now, and you can see empty number of ways in which movements were understood. Resistance movements, reform movements. Um, in the Indian case, Rajni Kothari was talking about non-party political formation. Uh, and that's a way in which new social movements were understood. Ganesh Shyam Shah and many others, talking about social movements in the newer variety in India, were pointing towards this, where there is a criticism of conventional political parties and their agendas, and bringing in newer elements into the social and political fabric was what new social movements were trying to do. So if non-party political formations, they may or may not include all kinds of issues that political parties, etc., were taking up, but there is a differentiation between how conventional political parties understood socio-political issues and how non-party movements understood it. There is a difference there, and that was projected by Kothari and others. So resistance movements, reform movements, non-party movements, some called many movements as single issue movements, whether that's right or wrong. There can be debates on that, but there were many single issue movements and so on and so forth. So movements, and apart from uh, national liberation movements and many other things. Um, a way of coming into the analysis of new social movements were happening when from the 60s onwards, there was the critique of development by the dependency school, by the world system school, and so on and so forth. So that critique of development that was coming up in the dependency theorists helped to pave the groundwork for contemporary new social movement thinking. So that 60s contribution was there. So you have Gundra Frank trying to, um, you know, place a critical notion on development by his famous work, Development of Underdevelopment. And then Gunther Frank and Martha Fuentes in the early 90s were talking about new social movements per se. And that 9 thesis on new social movements was very important. And those 9 theses by Fuentes and Frank talked about certain features of new social movements. One was the temporary nature of the movements, because reform movements or national liberation movements, etc., had much longer, lifespan. But Frank and Fuentes and some others also were talking about new social movements coming and going uh, based on particular issues and contexts. But those movements are very significant, but they were not there to stay for long. So that kind of um, short-term temporality was understood to be one phenomenon attached with new social movements. Um, Frankenfuentes was also talking about the ethical dimensions of new social movements. So it's thinking about new normativity, uh, new norms, new ethical notions, and new notions of justice that were part of the new social movements, which were, for them and many others, were qualitatively different from the normative structures of old movements. Um, if the dependency theorists were, on the one hand, critiquing development and later, by the 90s, projecting uh, agendas of new social movements, Wallerstein and others, Immanuel Wallerstein, the new the old dependency theorist and the world system theory that Wallerstein and others uh, brought in, Wallerstein was writing about anti-systemic movements, where he included working class movements, where he included resistance movements of various kinds as constituting anti-systemic movements. And he was not making this distinction between the new and the old in the way in which Frank and others were trying to make. Um, so there were several ways in which movements were understood. What was important uh, in the last 10, 15 years is thinking about various questions linking with the neoliberal conditions in which we live. And across the world, that's important. Um, I myself worked on new social movements uh, in the academic sense from um, you know from the 90s onwards, when this was becoming an important debate. And new social movements for me at that time, I worked on for critiquing um, the neoliberal ideology itself and neoliberal um, political theory and international relations theories of that time. I used uh, the, the kind of knowledge that was produced by social movements of various kinds. For example, the fish workers movement, traditional fish workers movement um, in Kerala and across the coastal uh, localities of India and across the world as well. And the farmers movement, I worked on that, particularly the Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangha, led by Dr. Nanjundaswamy. And you would see that a critique of contemporary neoliberal uh, arrangement, global arrangement, was critiqued by these movements in an immense way and in a very um, in-depth manner as well. When the Uruguay round of negotiations in the general agreements on trade and tariffs, GATT, was happening, and slowly the GATT giving way to a clear-cut global trading organization itself which came into being in the mid 90s as the WTO. So that's that establishment of the WTO from the old GATT. And what was happening in that whole process, the Dangle draft, its discussions, particularly on intellectual property, and how everything that human beings do were brought in the purview of capital, and into the purview of the private interests through such processes. So the farmers' movement was bringing in these issues and educating the farmers and the public in general about the implications, the future implications, also not only implications then and there, of how seeds, how farming equipment, how processes of farmers' life itself, and how the market for the producers, etc., will be affected through these neoliberal changes in the international economic order. So movements for me was an important, um, foil through which if, we can have a perspective on not only what's going on at the local level through the movements, but also at nation states policies, at the international neoliberal condition in general, and how the nation states were becoming an important arm of the neoliberal global order that was emerging in a big manner by the 1990s. So movements, what we call the new social movements in a manner, provide us with the opportunities, and this is an important point that I want to raise. The movements provide us with an opportunity to look at uh, our own politics, both at the local and at the national levels, and also at the international level. So it is a means to which, or if you understand these movements, you can always see uh, what they offer as a standpoint to critically look at the conditions in which we live, and thereby understand uh, the way in which civil society functions, the way in which state functions, and the way in which the international order or disorder or whatever that is functions. So for civil society and state, for the social and the political, it is important that one can look at them through the prism of new social movements and get critical kind of knowledge about the system. So those people who are weathered to and attuned to established theories and sets of knowledge that support the systemic endeavors of hegemonic forces, capital and political forces, etc. Those kinds of uh, elements could be critically understood if one has a movement's perspective, and that's very, very significant. So even though these movements emerge in particular contexts of civil society, they also provide us with political perspectives, which are needed not only to critically look at conventional political parties and the mechanisms of the way in which market function, but it also provides us with certain tools for thinking about future of politics, uh, newer kinds of um, possibilities of politics, where in the neoliberal era that possibility of politics itself is curtailed through uh, the mechanisms of the state and the market to control people, to govern people through a technologically armed state, um, a militaristic kind of state, a police kind of state, how in such periods of extreme uh, surveillance on people in the neoliberal context, how that kind of disarming the people could be critically looked at, and resources for resisting such a surveillance state, militaristic state, could be achieved. So new social movements provide us with certain tools to look at both our society's hegemonic ways of working and uh, providing us the tools to critically look at how the state and international capital works. This is very important. And new social movements are relevant in that sense. You have seen whether it was the Adivasi movements in Kerala, the Mutanga struggle, and other things, and the CAA, anti-CAA struggle last December that you have seen in Delhi and across India, these movements are not conventionally, they can be placed as social movements in that general sense, but they are extremely political, as you know. The Adivasi movement was talking about the provisions of the Constitution, the provisions for self-determination of the Adivasis, and teaching the mainstream society in Kerala through the Matanga movement and in other parts of India through Adivasi movements. They were teaching us basic lessons of politics, nation-state politics, constitutional. And what are the provisions in the Constitution? Um, what does citizenship ultimately mean? And who are the people who have a right to own land, for example? And many things were thrown out. There were big political lessons to mainstream society, which never understood the meaning of the Constitution properly. The Adivasis have to teach us all to look at the Constitution carefully. The anti-CAA movements were talking again about citizenship, because citizenship of the Muslims, citizenship of um, different communities, undocumented people, etc., were being challenged by the state. So what does citizenship mean ultimately? How can the state determine the basic idea of citizenship? Because the Constitution says that we give unto us, the Constitution. And if we, the people, did that, we are the sovereign entity. The nation state is only the institutional mechanism to ensure that. But what you have seen is the state usurping that sovereign citizenship of people and disenfranchising, making many people non-citizens by enacting certain laws. So the CAA was brought in for making people non-citizens. So such movements on the streets of India were talking about not only the social, but about core issues in contemporary politics. So you can see that, and these are all not, in their origins or um, in the way in which mobilization was done, in the way in which the framing of the issues were made. They were not led by political parties or anything of that sort. These were people's initiatives of various kinds. And you have seen, women were in the forefront of the anti-CAA struggle, Muslim women, especially very courageous women, and how, um, you know, not through conventional means of organizations and parties and other things, but with new enthusiasm and new way of critiquing um, the hegemony that exists. That were part and parcel of these movements. Um, I'll just mention one or two more things and then stop, and I'll be happy um, to see what kind of discussion that the audience here want to have. Um, what are movements ultimately? Movements, when you say movement, when I raise my hand, my hand is moving. In order to wage any kind of movement, what is there with us? We have our human bodies with us. I have my body to make any kind of movement. Various body parts can move. And you call it a kind of social movement or anything of that sort when human bodies express themselves in a particular civil society context, in a particular political context, where we employ the movement of our body uh, in a given situation, in a particular manner, mostly in a creative manner, in order to critique the existing um, hegemonic and conservative ways in which societies are constituted. So if the materiality of our body is at the center of any kind of movement that we can make, what is the requirement to critique conventional parties, conventional movements, except particularly organized movements? Because most new social movements are not very organized in an organizational sense, in a structural sense, because they are mostly coming out of the enthusiasm of people, not um, well structured in that sense. What is important here is that whether the human conglomeration of human bodies, whether they make any kind of advancement in the way we think about societies and politics. When Iyengar was bringing in uh, new, ways of struggle, new ways of human bodies deployment in the street, that was a big challenge to the existing conservative social order, and the way um, that when um, new ways of struggle was launched by Iyengar on the street, which was the free movement of people were denied. The Dalits were denied at that point of time. When they entered those streets in a particular manner, That was a challenge. It evoked responses, both for and mostly against the demands of such movements. But they created a stir in society. A churning was coming forth. And any worthwhile movement will create that kind of a stir, a kind of, you know, dynamics in motion. And many movements achieved that in their particular times, and some of those influences remained for the rest of history. With conventional political parties and organizations, what happened, even though they may be a result of movements and very significant movements at certain point of time, some of them have become almost like an if you see the demonstrations, etc., on the street, they would look like a military parade or something like that. So disciplined, well within the contours of uh, what was supposed to be the normal way of conducting a movement. And that may not evoke any response because that is stale. And where political parties are losing out, conventional political, when new right wing and new kinds of hegemonic forces take that space, that's mainly because of the inability to creatively deploy human bodies in a newer manner. Because most of them were following conventional principles of organizations. So, what the new movements, what you see through the farmers' movement now, or the anti-CAA movement and others, what you see is a different way of projecting oneself and having a kind of collectivity um, created through newer ways of organizing. How the Sikh community's own, Langas system, etc., were brought into the streets where food is prepared on the streets by the farmers from Haryana and Punjab and so on, or how Muslim women um, of different generations led the anti-CAA struggle in Delhi. You remember that last year. So you could see that new ways of projecting our own selves on the street. That performativity, that way of performing our movements in a particular political and social context is a significant aspect of contemporary movements which are of relevance to us. So that's an important aspect, the performative aspect of the deployment of the materiality of the body is an important aspect of movements. Uh, I'll just, as a last point, would mention about the neoliberal conditions, which I've mentioned earlier. Um, there was Asif Bayat um, and academics like him was talking about non-movements, not new social movements or anything, which was he was writing about Egypt, about the Cairo city, um, just before the um, Arab uprising. And by non-movements, he was talking about what he called quiet encroachment, a slow, unspoken way of encroaching this space. Um, this is usually done by um, you know, merchants on the street, not conventional merchants who have a shop, etc. These are street vendors who, according to the state, is doing an illegal activity by encroaching the road or the roadside and so on and so forth. And the neoliberal economic and social conditions have made them totally, you know, out of any kind of space. And the urban space is now being designed in such a manner to avoid all kinds of, um, you know, lively activities, as you know, people's daily lives. Um, and street vendors have always shown that, according to Asif Bharat, um, the ability to hold on to their spaces, um, even while state, the police was trying to dislodge them from their own, activities on the street. They know how to pack off and move, and then just be back within half an hour and start the trade again. You So this is a kind of not leaving the space, not giving completely to the state, giving up one's own livelihood means, etc., but circumventing the state and standing there. And that kind of quiet encroachment was significant. That non-movement aspect, creating a new urban space where people can do their livelihood activities, which in a way was also giving rise to movements like the Arab uprising on the streets of Tunis or in Cairo in Tahrir Square and so on that you've seen. So non-movements are also in a way paving the way to movements actually perform on the streets. But these kinds of quiet encroachment is is not a movement. There's no spectacle to see. Uh, there's no completely organized structure, but there is a rhythm to that of um, you know stopping the state from encroaching their own livelihood. So there are different ways of looking at movements. So the non-movement angle would be another major step towards that. I'll stop here and would be happy if there are certain responses um, that comes from the audience. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay. So I think we can move into a question answer session, right, sir?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So as of now, there are no questions being posted in the chat box. You can post your questions in the chat box so that sir will be able to answer them. As of now, there are no questions in the chat
Oh,
box.
okay, okay.
It would be great if there are more questions so that the session would be more lively and more ideas will be conveyed to the audience.
If there's nothing more, then I think
Sir,
we can
there is a question from
call it a day.
Subramanian
Yeah,
N.
yeah.
These no social movements are creative, performative, and helpful in producing a critique against the neoliberal order. But how effective are they?
Um, that's about the consequences of these movements, how many people call how successful they are. And so you see, it's very difficult to measure the success of movements because you don't know what effect that these movements create in particular societies. Um, you know, when the Narmada struggle was going on for quite a long time, what are its actual material successes? Not much, because there are lots of people yet to be rehabilitated. Many of the environmental issues raised by the movement is still not being addressed to in any meaningful manner. So if one assesses such a movement um, by the material benefits such movements brought in, then you may find that there's not much, even though it achieved a whole lot, but in a general sense. But that's not how the Narmada movement is assessed, because it created greater ecological consciousness, and though such kind of consciousness persists even now, and it created the ways of people's own organization for particular purposes, and it created strong, um, women's own leadership from the grassroots, and raised several questions about the way in which so-called development was, progressing in the Indian context. A critique of that development model was forthcoming. So the value of such organizations for raising consciousness in people uh, was very great. So if uh, that's a success or not, it produced a whole lot of new gamut of um, values and consciousness in the minds of people, and that's extremely significant. So movements need not necessarily be, um, you know, evaluated on the basis of the immediacy of that success. For example, what the anti-CAA protests have brought in, and that struggle has to continue, as we all know, but it provided us with many questions on how a neo-fascist kind of regime can really destroy the very fabric of the nation, and how citizenship was becoming now the prerogative of um, a kind of religious majority. That majoritarianism was questioned, so basic democratic principles were brought into the fore. And it was very important, and it is still very important in the anti-fascist and democratic struggles in our country. So I won't evaluate movements uh, through the success of the immediate agendas of those movements, but what kind of values and consciousness they produce.
Okay, we have another question by Shibina Elai. Why the single issue movement can be called as a social movement?
At that time when people were talking about single issue movements, etc., they were either, particular local movements, maybe on questions of environment, or movements which were against, say, the pollution that a factory produces, or there were many issues, local issues that were taken up. And at one level, this seemed to be a single issue movement, single agenda, either closing down a particular factory or making the state withdraw from a particular project and things of that sort. But that's always done by a, a mass of people, a, a group of people, or a collectivity of some kind. So it's something social in that sense of, but that's why I'm not stressing on single issue, because they themselves generate, if it's an environmental movement, then they generate a consciousness, as I've just mentioned in response to the earlier question. So it goes well beyond the single issue per se on the way. So a development, a critique of development that they bring in, or any of those, or an environmental, consciousness that they bring in, they are very significant. That's not limited to that single issue on which they immediately struggle.
Next question is by Dingle K. Vijayan. Why social movements in India ended up nothing in recently? Is it because of the protesters or the authorities who are acting to gain any particular political agenda?
No, first of all, as I mentioned, these movements mostly are not organized by political parties. And most of these movements are critical of conventional political parties. So that's a major distinction. So whatever political parties do, that's for their particular purposes. Some political parties may support such movements, some oppose. If you are a ruling party, then you would be opposing such movements vehemently. More so if you are an authoritarian kind of state, then the suppression of such movements is the main thing in their agenda. But one has to distinguish between conventional political party agendas and the agendas of movements. That's one thing. The other one is, the initial part of that question seems to be again about the failure of movements. That's not whatever I was mentioning in response to the earlier questions, was that you cannot measure the success or failure of a movement by just sticking on to the notion that this agenda is not achieved. Even if it's not achieved, better it is achieved. But even if it's not achieved, what is the anti-CAA struggle is still in our mind, isn't it? It's not over. So there is an urge for people to come forward and express their feelings about our contemporary politics in a newer manner. That's the lesson that you learn. If we don't learn that lesson, then it's a problem with us, not with the movement.
Okay. So, next question is by Dr. Nishikanta Tongam. Have new social society of different nature. Please mention developed and underdeveloped society.
This whole distinction between developed and underdeveloped, that is what is being questioned by,
Yeah.
uh, you know, the dependency and the world system theorists that I was talking about. Because development and underdevelopment, Gunther Frank's famous notion that they are not two stages of development. From underdeveloped, you go to developed, and so on. No, these are processes. The process through which, if some develop, others underdevelop. So underdevelopment can be perpetuated. So that is the development of underdevelopment that Gunther Frank was talking about. You can underdevelop a set of people by exploitation, by various means. So don't imagine that from underdevelopment you will go to development. No, certain areas of the world, and imperialism was all about this, or still about that. Certain regions would be so-called developed and certain others underdeveloped. And that always um, there is a linkage between somebody's underdevelopment and somebody else's development. That's why the farmers are on strike. This benefits certain business interests and capitalist class in India. The new set of laws regarding the farming sector, and it underdevelops millions of farming communities in India. So Ambani's and Adani's development is underdevelopment for millions of people. And this is about nation states also, you could see, across the world. So don't think of underdevelopment and development as stages in human progress, etc. They are basically interconnected phenomena which can be perpetuated. So we can be more underdeveloped also if such processes of expropriation of resources continue.
Next question is by her itself, Dr. Nishikanta Tongam. Which type of society is considered as good if women power is very poor?
I did not understand that question properly. You know, if that
I
person is
think
there,
society can be called as good if women are in power. That must be the question. Like women are not in power. That question is not that clear even to me too.
no, it's not clear.
Should we go to the next question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Next question is by Subramanian N. How come the farmers' protest can be seen as new social movement just because it doesn't has a conventional political party, but they have a very well structured organization, leadership, and the organized peasantry as subjects.
Yeah. Um, yeah, Subru's question is
Yeah,
well
Subru's question.
taken. Uh, you know, don't insist on the label. I'm not very particular about whether you call it new social movement but it's a very significant movement. So that we all agree. Um, new social movements are not distinguished with other movements of the past, etc. Not by um, the organizational aspect per se. Yes, the organizational aspect may come in. Um, the only thing is that it's not the conventional organization techniques employed by political parties, by conventional uh, movements, etc. What you have seen in recent times is alternate sets of leaderships emerging whenever there is a leadership. And most often, these things come up within a a span of time um, need not be long enough because this is a process that started with the thinking about and the enactment of particular laws. So organizations would emerge according to this requirement. The agenda is not something else. For political parties, etc., there are umpteen number of agendas. So here you have an immediate crisis that has emerged and responding to that. So there is an organic sense in which leadership emerges. Um, According to the resources I mean not simply economic resources, but personals, um, intellectual inputs, uh, political acumen, many other kinds of resources. Depending upon the deployment of those things, newer leadership emerge and fast movement have shown that. Particularly, you know, um, taking a lot of um, sense from conventional, um, Sikh traditions of shared meals, of cooking and serving in the gurudwaras that you have seen, and there's somewhat an organized mechanism to do that. But employing those kinds of techniques and conventions into the movement realm is very important, and that is done by the leadership. So the point is that the leadership organically emerge according to the requirements of the movement. And this is not something um, that is akin to conventional political party organizations.
Next question is by Sionti Sengupta. Do you think social media in contemporary times provided more impetus to the movement as the information from mainstream media has often proved to be distorted and biased towards a particular color?
I agree with the sense of that question, whether new ways of sharing information through the new media, social media in particular, um, whether they assist movements. Yes, they do. But um, there is also an implication in the question that the bias is only from mainstream media. There are biases in social media as well, and we see it on an everyday scale, isn't it? Both in the very algorithms they use and in the way in which one's own ideology functions in social media interactions. So you would know only what you want to know because there is a regulation of that happening through the algorithm itself in the social media without we ourselves knowing in most cases. In other cases, people know, but they take it for granted. So the social media realm is also distorted and biased. But yes, the technology provides scope for lots of interaction. That that's true, but not without biases.
Right. Next question. I think let's consider this as the last question. So we can't expect social movements like Arab Spring in India if it failed to get support from any political parties. Okay, she meant we can expect, not can't expect. She meant we can expect.
Okay. No, she says that
Sorry, sir.
movements like the Arab Spring um,
Yeah.
would fail if political party support is not generated, isn't it? Um, at one level, if movements become significant, well noticed, and um, the agendas of those movements, the issues they raise, become significant part of our political consciousness, yes, political parties will be compelled to recognize that, and um, at least certain parties would be compelled to align with those movements. Um, the we cannot say that movements like Arab Spring um, are not happening in India or elsewhere. It happened in New York, the anti-Wall Street protests in New York, taking inspiration from the Arab uprising. Or what's happening in India now, even though it may not be linked with the Arab uprising, etc., but strong movements happening, very significant movements happening. Whether they are enough to politically settle a state or not is another question. But when political parties fail, when conventional political order fails to address the neo-fascist nature of the state, to address the corporate interests that the state now represents, if these movements raise such questions, they are significant. And what is important, particularly those who are hearing this, for all of us, what is important is to recognize the significance of such movements and at least see that we generate enough momentum, um, if not along the lines of those movements, but newer momentum in order to address those critical issues. That's required. I have always seen people accusing others of not doing anything. What are you doing? In social media, you will always see this. But that question should be directed to the person who asked that question, isn't it? What are you doing to oneself? What am I doing? Uh, that should be the starting point, and then there can be a collectivity. Um, so that's very, very important.
So can you be more louder?
You can't hear me?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now okay, now okay.
Okay.
Now it's perfect. Yeah. So
No,
there is
I
a
was
comment.
just. Oh,
Yeah.
okay, come on.
Hoping that you are completed.
Yeah, yeah, you can read
Yeah,
the
there's a
comment.
comment from Subramanian. These are again doubtful distinctions. Yeah, these are again doubtful distinctions. Conventional political parties also use creative techniques for their movement. They also have tactical, immediate interest and long-term interest. Leadership do emerge or organically within conventional organizations. And he has also thanked you for the lecture.
Yeah. Okay. Um, you know, if some political parties survive out of various crises, etc., yes, then they have uh, employed certain newer ways of organizing, isn't it? But what you see in general is um, one has to agree to that there is a, a kind of rigidity um, that many parties or conventional organizations, this is not only for political parties, but conventional organizations, um, like NGOs, for example, they also have their own bureaucracies and structures. They can't be the people who can, wage movements, mainly because of these bureaucratic structural problems attached with those things. But that won't make uh, political parties irrelevant or anything of that sort. As I've already mentioned, movements also raise political issues. And therefore, what is required is on those political issues, there should be some give and take between conventional political parties and the movements. That can happen. Um, and to an extent, it happened, anti CAA struggles, etc. It happened to an extent. That can happen. But you might have seen, and many students here know, why there is a kind of distancing from conventional organizations, etc. Because many places people see that creativity is not something that is tolerated beyond a limit. That's where bureaucratic mindset and conventional organizations come in the way of expressing or performing the kind of roles that we have been talking about on the street or in the context of movements and so on. But I think the politics of movements and politics of organizations are very significant. So, in a way of talking about, this is the topic that uh, Anak gave to me, and I'm not proposing that this should be the line that even I should follow or everybody should follow. I was just talking about how these things were discussed. But movements are extremely significant, uh, no doubt about it. If you equate newer kinds of movements with conventional political parties, that would not be um, a way to go forward. They have their differences as well.
Yeah. Okay, so there are no more questions, I feel. Like there are no questions in the chat box. If any, you can drop, or else we can wind up the session. It's been 1.5 hours since Ramki is sorry, sir is sitting with us. So
No problem.
yeah, so it's been 1.5 hours he's sitting with us. So I think we can wind up the session, hoping that there are no more questions. So anyhow, I have dropped the feedback link in the chat box. Kindly fill the same. And I, in the name of on behalf of IQAC and Research Committee, Maharaja's College, I thank Professor Dr. A.K. Ramakrishnan, who has joined with us today and gave a wonderful, very interesting, and very informative lecture. And I once again thank the IQAC and Research Committee who have given me the opportunity to coordinate the webinar, so that I was fortunate enough to bring such people to the participants and give an opportunity to interact with them. So thank you, sir, once again, and hoping that you will be joining us in the future also.
Good seeing you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Bye.